Session one, we talked about the men of Issachar. They were folks who understood the times, and they knew what Israel should do. Those two things are kind of what we're trying to do, is figure out how do we understand the actual changing context in which we find ourselves, and also know what to do as a church. And so here we are in this post-Christian society that we live in, whether it's Brainerd or Parker's Prairie, it's post-Christian. And like Lewis and Clark, we've had these trusty, reliable canoes that have helped us. And now we found ourselves in uncharted territory, and there's Rocky Mountains in front of us. What are we going to do? We got to get out of the canoes and find some new way to continue the mission, even if we have to abandon some of the vehicles that got us this far. We talked about the rise of the nuns and how we function today as the away team rather than the home team, and how that means that, among other things, the Christian presence isn't the sort of center of the table. We're not at the big boy table all the time anymore. We're sort of on the periphery. The Bible and the church are more out of favor than ever, but more important and relevant than ever. And instead of a response of worry or going on the war path or withdrawal, we're gonna talk about the winsomeness of Christ and reclaim our missionary identity. Figure out, let's get back to the way the church was in the beginning when Jesus first kicked out a bunch of disciples into a very hostile world that was not receptive to Christian faith, and how that early New Testament church functioned there. We need to also function in those same ways. We're going to talk about some of those today. The missionary goes on to a foreign field. You learn the language, you listen around, you try to figure out how to connect with the timeless truth in a new context. And that's what we are forced to do in the day and age which we live. I thought I'd throw out something here. We talked about how we're at kind of like an inflection point, right? Historically, it feels like there's something big going on. It reminds us of other eras when the church has experienced big change. So we have, in the 16th century, we had guys like Martin Luther and John Calvin and others. And what was that area of time called? Do you remember? That was called the Reformation. It was a reforming of the church, a reformation. Martin Luther was a young guy. This is 500 years ago now, but he suffered from a lot of depression and anxiety and angst internally. He was a spiritually nervous person. He was convinced, partly because of the teaching of the Catholic Church at the time, that he could never get totally right with God. He was always overwhelmed and burdened with his sin. He felt contaminated, and he just felt like he was condemned. So he'd go to the priest again and again and again. He'd fall on his knees and just recite every thought and motive he had to try to get purged of this. And the second he'd walk out the door, he would feel like he was impure and unholy again. It was a very depressing cycle. He's 21 years old. He's a law student. He's riding his horse, and he gets caught in a horrible rainstorm, thunderstorm, and branches are falling and everything all around him. The horse that he's on bucks him off, and he lands in a puddle amidst all this thunder and lightning bolt, and he makes a bargain prayer with God. You ever made one of those? God, if you get me out of this, I'll go into the ministry. I'll become a monk. I'll become a priest. And God came through with his end of the deal. He lived through that horrific event, and he stuck with his end of the deal, and he becomes this super conscientious priest. But he finds out that it still doesn't relieve him from his cycle of despair. And so he's going to his superiors all the time, like, help me with this, help me. And they finally get so frustrated with him, they just like throw him a Bible and said, here, read this, which was sort of a novel idea in the day. He reads the book of Romans, and he comes across that phrase, the righteous shall live by faith. Words that today we kind of take for granted, like, well, who doesn't know that? Well, he didn't know that the righteous shall live by faith. Righteousness isn't by your good works and doing enough to get cleaned up, but by our faith in Christ we can achieve and attain, be given righteousness. And that was the true lightning bolt in his life. It totally changes his paradigm, everything. It was not really a discovery. What was it? It was a rediscovery of something that was always there, just that nobody saw. See? So he has these light bulbs go off. He dared to look beyond what everybody else was thinking about. And he said, we've got to look with fresh eyes at this old truth. And he started to make some waves about it, and he went to the Facebook of his day, which was the Wittenberg door, and nailed 95 theses, which was a way of sort of putting something on the bulletin board to say, you got to hear what I have to say, and he had 95 different points. His message essentially was, I love this church, but something's got to change. That was the message of Martin Luther, and that became the beginnings of a massive reformation of the church. And I think we're all sensing we might be in one of those eras right now where I love this church, but something's got to change. If we don't, we're dead. So something's got to change. One little reminder for me that's haunting a little bit, I just give to you today as we start out, is that the establishment churches in that day didn't take very kindly to voices like Martin Luther. Okay? Establishment meaning those who were the traditional, accepted, this is the way the church is kind of people. They did not like Martin Luther. In fact, he wasn't trying to start anything new. He was trying to reform from within, saying, we've got to change this thing. And they were like, we're not having it. And they booted him out, and it ended up becoming this whole other thing called Protestantism, where they were sort of protesting, and that's the tribe out of which we arise eventually, because they just new questions, they wouldn't entertain it. They pushed it down. They shoved him out the door. Sometimes we get more worried about what we might lose than what we might gain if we follow the Lord to a new place. And it's not always easy to know what's a heretical, rogue voice that's bringing some dangerous new idea, and what, in fact, is the Spirit of God that's leading us to a new place we really need to go if we're going to follow Him. It's not always easy to know the difference, but there is that's the challenge for the church today. We are going to talk about change today in the next session. And one of the things that brings the church stability is that we resist certain kinds of change. That's one of our strengths. We're not just thrown around by every wind of doctrine, by every fad that comes and goes. One of the dangers of the church, however, is the same thing. We resist change so well, right? It's one of our downfalls. Resisting change can sometimes mean resisting God and His leadership and where He's trying to take us. So that's what we're praying for, some sort of discernment to know the difference. When are we just resisting culture and patting ourselves on the back for being faithful, when in fact we're resisting what God's trying to shake us up and do? And so if we can get to the bottom of that, we'll be way ahead of the game. And that's sort of a good introduction maybe to just maybe one more reminder would be Jesus sort of taught all this same stuff, right? Remember, do you remember his teaching on wineskins? I've got a picture of a wineskin. I've never seen one, really used one. Not much of a wine drinker myself, but Mark 2:22, Jesus says, you can't put new wine in old wineskins. So the wineskins was their, Nalgene bottle of the day. They carried it around, and that's what they drank was wine. And wine, when it's new, ferments and foments. It expands. The gases that are emitted kind of expand, and so there's a gurgling and moving of the wine itself. And so the container has to be able to flex with that, has to be able to be supple and soft and to move with that. You put a cap on it and the thing has to be able to move. And if you got some new wine and you stuck it in an old wineskin that's been sitting in your dashboard for 6 years and it's all crusty and dry, right? It's going to be brittle, and as soon as you put the new wine in there, what's going to happen? It's not going to be able to contain it. And the Spirit of God is like the new wine. God is on the move. He's not stuck and stable and stagnant somewhere. He's new wine, he's gurgling, and there's movement, and there's got to be new wine to contain it. And so the church itself sometimes needs to realize, how do we need to become new wineskins and able to contain what God really wants to do? God wants to transform lives through the church. We're the plan A, as we said. And so that's our metaphor as we head into today, new wineskins. A couple quick things about the nuns we talked about yesterday. Let me mention a couple things before I leave that, and then we're going to start talking about some keys, I think, and I'm going to give you 3 big ones and then about 7 more quick ones at the end. The nuns, by the way, fastest growing religious group in America today. A couple things about them that I think are interesting just to pay attention to. Number one, 56% of them are male. So when you look at those who say, I don't have any affiliation with religion today, In American society as a whole, just population-wise, there's just slightly more females than males. But in the nuns, there's a higher percentage of males, isn't that it? I don't know what that says, or I don't know how to analyze it. I just think it's something we ought to pay attention to. And as you get down the scale toward like hardened atheists, the percentage of males increases even more. So like among atheists, 64% of those are male. I don't know what that means, but it means we ought to be paying attention to how we do church and connecting. If you want to connect with a nun, you better be able to connect with a man. They're young. The older you are in our society, the more likely you are to be affiliated with religion in some way. The younger you are in our society, the less likely. I'll show you some stats in a little bit. Third, a lot of them are white. As our country becomes much more diverse and variegated culturally and ethnically, interestingly, the irreligious are becoming more white. 71% of the nuns are white. Really interesting. I don't know what that means. It just means we probably ought to know it. Also, they're not necessarily atheists. This is a really important point. A lot of nuns who are saying, I don't have anything to do with the church, believe God exists. They believe there is a God. They're just not buying traditional Christianity because of what they've come to believe about the church or Christians that they know, their impressions. But they're not religious in that sense. 75% of nuns have never attended a service, a religious service. Think about that, 75%. I'll get back to some of that in a little bit too. Also, I think this is interesting. It also relates to a point we were making last night about not being overly affiliated with a certain political bent or marrying our gospel so that you have to sort of come through a political persuasion to get to it. Well, one reason that might be interesting for us is nuns are among the most reliably Democratic voters. 2008, 75% of those who were nuns voted for Barack Obama. Interesting to know. They tend to be much more progressive and liberal on social issues, like whatever, legalization of pot or something like that. They're going to be much more progressive than you're going to typically find, certainly in evangelical circles. So those are interesting things for us to pay attention to. So if we make all of those sort of litmus tests for getting in the door to our churches, like you got to have our political view on everything, even to begin the conversation, we may never get them to Jesus. Now, a lot of those political views might even change, but let's get Jesus out there first, right? So those are some things that are interesting and important. They're not really seekers. This is a big change from when I started in earnest in ministry, like in the 80s. We used the word seeker to describe, you kind of had believers and seekers. And we kind of thought those were the two groups. You kind of had people who were already sold, they're already convinced, and you had a bunch of other people, they were sort of the seekers. Well, if you're not a believer today, you're probably not seeking. More than likely you're not seeking. Rather, they're sort of indifferent to the Christian faith. 88% say they are not looking for faith or a specific religion. It's not like, hey, which one? It's like, spirituality? Sure. God? Probably. A specific religion? Not for me. Okay. Are you at least seeking? No, not a priority for me. So that's the mindset today. That's a shift. They're not really seeking. The greatest challenge to Christianity doesn't come from other religions. It comes from a rejection of all forms of religion. That's where we are today. Nuns aren't, this is a quote from Barry Cosman, nuns aren't thinking about religion and rejecting it. They're not thinking about it at all. There's a word that somebody coined, I don't remember who now, but I kind of stuck with me. It sort of describes the typical, an apatheist. You recognize the word apathy means I don't care. And, like a theist is what you believe about God. So it's like, I just don't care. That's not bad. That's a pretty good description. I just don't care about your religion or anyone else's. It's a sort of a shrug of the shoulders. What they do know, the little bit that they know about Christianity is they're typically turned off because it's too tangled up in politics or money or whatever their perception might be. And this is due to the privatization of our society, which says truth resides in every individual. There's no sort of universal truth anymore. It's like all up to you, whatever you think, and that's kind of the mentality, right? That's called privatization. Faith is a matter of personal preference, right? So God, if God's your hobby, great. Just don't push it on me. It's a private thing. And the other trend that leads to this is pluralization, where Christianity is just sort of one as you go through a smorgasbord or a buffet, you can pick and choose what you want and put it on your plate. And you might like, pickles on your salad or not, but that Christianity is just a pickle. And some people like it, some people don't. And that's called pluralization, whereas a particular faith used to be judged as right or wrong based on what you believed was true. Now, a faith is judged to be right or wrong if you claim that there even is a truth. See the difference? Reality is determined by majority vote in our day and age. And so that's what pluralization looks like. So those are some things I think to think about. I think the big difference here is we're living in a time when it's one thing. If I try to convince you, you're going to fly from Minneapolis Airport to Orlando, and you're going to go to Disney World, and I'm trying to convince you to switch from Delta to Southwest Airlines. Because Southwest Airlines, bags fly free, it's a better culture, it's a lot more fun, the airline attendants are a lot more friendly, and it's cheaper, and I got all these advantages trying to convince you to switch from Delta to Southwest Airlines. That's kind of how the church had the luxury of thinking in a previous generation. We were talking to people who were already sold on flying, wanted to go to the destination, and we're just kind of talking about which airline. And churches grew like crazy in that environment. Now we're trying not to get them to switch from Delta to Southwest. That's called transfer growth. You're talking to the already convinced. We're trying to talk to people now that aren't even sure they want to go to Disney and they don't want to fly. So it's a long way to get them into the airport, down the tarmac, through security, and into seat 15C when you aren't even sure you want to go anywhere, let alone fly. It's a different conversation. And so that's why I think we've got to pay attention to how we lead with what we think our mission is. We're going to get to that in a minute about what we lead with. Let me give you one more analogy, and I hope these analogies kind of help connect with you a little bit. This one I heard from James Emery White, and he goes into this big thing, how he hates buying cars. And he says, and I apologize if there's any car salesmen in the room, but his experience is he hates it. He says, sales staff waits like vultures. They descend on you before you get out of your car. I hate how they get pushy to get information about you, what you want to spend, are you going to trade, and you got to be coy about that and not give too much information. It's like a mind game. And then there's some other guy that comes out of the back office and acts like he's the finance director, and all he's trying to do is sell you more extras, and it's a big game, and it's a pushy thing, and you're haggling over price, you're going back and forth, and you have to bone up on the car so you know the actual price, so you know if they're trying to shaft you. I hate it, he says. I just don't like it. And so he says, as a result, I didn't buy cars for a long time. He drove these cars to over he had two cars over $200,000 each. But finally, one broke down. He had to buy a car. Okay? He says, you're not going to believe this, but I actually like buying a car today. And I look forward to going back to the next time. So what happened? He says, one word, CarMax. Their slogan, if you're familiar with y'all familiar with CarMax? They have a slogan, the way car buying should be. And it's changed this guy's attitude about how to buy cars. You skip the lot, you go online, you select what you're looking for, the type, the mileage, the price, and the features that you're looking for, and then you put it in the search engine with these parameters, and it sort of kicks out the cars, and it's a no-haggle policy. It's like, there's the price, simple. It's not going to go up or down, that's it. It takes that whole thing out of play, and you can explore financing on the site if you want to, and you can sign up and go do a test drive. There's no bait and switch and all that, and they get there and they got the tags ready. There you go. He actually enjoys it. So it turned a reluctant, even hostile customer into sort of a raving fan. And all it took was a different process, a different pathway. Same transaction, same product, Same goal, but radically different experience. And so I think I kind of liked that analogy because it makes me think about how could we rethink our church experience for the perspective of the typical person who basically, they don't necessarily hate God, they just hate what they've come to experience about church. Okay, in the same way that he dreaded CarMax. He didn't dread cars. People don't dread God. What he dreaded was the experience that he had come to associate with having to get one. So the only reason he ever went is when he was absolutely forced to, and that's why most people in our society, the only time they go to a church is if there's a wedding or a funeral. Well, what if we could change the way that people experienced God in a church setting, just like CarMax has figured out how to change it for buying a car? Because people do still want God, but what they need is a different strategy or approach or way of doing church, and that's what we want to talk about today, I think. And so I want to give you what I would consider to be some traits of churches that I believe will flourish in the new world that we're living in, okay? So here's what I would say first. I would say if a church is going to get unstuck and move forward in our culture, I'm going to dwell on this first one for a little while, and as soon as I say it, some of you are going to be like, I'm already tracking, I'm already there. Some of you are not going to say, I'm sure what you mean, but I'm going to dwell on it for a while on purpose, because I think a lot of us say we understand this, but I don't see churches doing it. So that's why I'm going to dwell on it. Number one is, a church that's going to thrive in the new world is going to be mission-driven. Mission-driven. So you're invited to think about what actually, in reality, drives your church. Like, what is the purpose, reason for existence of your church? And how can you show that that is true beyond just what you want to be true? How can we show whether we're mission driven? There's an old joke about a factory worker who every day he gets out of the factory and he's walking through. He has to go through the security gate to get out, and he's pushing a wheelbarrow, going to walk it right out and walk home. And in the wheelbarrow, he's got this little box sitting in the wheelbarrow. And he gets to the security gate, and the guy goes, "What's in the box?" He goes, "Just sawdust. Just sawdust. It's a byproduct, as you know, in the plant, and I use it at home for kindling. And I talked to my boss. He said I could take as much sawdust home as I want." And he goes, "Let me see the box." Opens the box, looks inside. Sure enough, it's just sawdust. Security guy's like, "All right, whatever, go ahead." So he closes up the box, he takes it out. Next day, same guy, here comes his wheelbarrow with a little box inside. And the security guard asks him the same question. "What's in the box?" He says, "Just sawdust." He goes, "Let me see." Opens it up, puts his hands all around there, just sawdust. Happens every day. Like after the fifth or sixth day, the security guard can't hardly stand it. He knows something's up. He says, "Listen," he says, "listen, I know you're up to something. I can't figure it out. I promise I won't turn you in. What's going on?" The guy says, "You promise you won't tell?" He says, "I promise." The guy looks around, he goes, "I'm stealing wheelbarrows." Okay, I'm stealing wheelbarrows. So here's the thing in the church. You ever think that sometimes we focus, we lock in on the thing we think's important, the box of sawdust. And there's a bigger thing that we can sometimes miss right in front of us. Mission-driven means you don't get focused on the sawdust box. You see the bigger picture of what's really going on. And this is what we mean by mission-driven. We can get distracted by the little things in front of us and miss what's most important. Sawdust goes out every day of churches, okay? We run programs. We got Sunday school. We got the ladies group that meets on Wednesdays. We got the kids thing going on. We got the choir, the men's meeting, the retreats we do. Ministers come and ministers go. We got the building, and we got the same old box of sawdust running out the door, and we can miss that bigger picture. And the big picture is, why are we here? What is the mission of the church? And now more than ever is a time when churches just need to be mission-driven. So let me just back up and remind us why the Bible says, what God's dream was when he dreamt up the church in the first place, right? Because guess what? God a missionary God. God is on a mission. John 3:16, right? Everybody knows it. God so loved the world that he gave his son. So he sent his son. Jesus becomes the first missionary, leaving a place of comfort to go on mission for the sake of God's heart to others. And then Jesus comes and fulfills that mission. He says in Luke 19:10, I think we got a slide for this. What does Jesus say? When he sums up why he came, he says what? I came to what? Seek and to save those who are lost. That's why he came. That's the reason. That was his what? Mission. He didn't come because he had nothing else to do. He came for a purpose, a reason. That's what mission is. He came, and then you look at his life. That's what he did. He ate with sinners. He dwelt with those who were far from God. He gave his very life for those people. And then, before he died, he says in John 20:21, as the Father has sent me, so I am sending you. Okay? So you want to follow me? Great. You think you're following me? Guess what? I'm still on mission. You're going to now be sent as well. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 20, this is the Apostle Paul. He says, God has now given us this same message of reconciliation, helping people see, listen, I know you can't stand the church, but you can be friends with God. That's our message. That's the message. That's the mission. Matthew 28, Jesus said it this way, go and make what? Go and make disciples of everyone. So it's not like the church has a mission. God has a mission. And the church is just part of it. And his mission happens to have a church. And that's why we're here. I came to seek and to save, so send I you, now go. So somewhere along the line, church in America kind of became a designed by Christians, primarily for Christians only, kind of a place. For a lot of American Christianity, that's what churches have become. But that's really not who we are. That's not what a mission-driven entity looks like. Churches that reflect the very identity of the heart of God and the nature of God are going to be places for people who don't like church, who feel like they don't belong with God. We're the only organization I know of on earth that exists for the benefit of non-members. Think about it. We exist for those who aren't yet part of us. So that kind of ruthless focus on mission, I think, is going to be a real key. Some of the ways that I think I would encourage you to do a real gut check and think about the church that you're a part of. Churches can get off track when they become member-driven. I see a lot of churches that are, when you get down to it, and let's just get real now, okay? Let's just stop talking about fancy theology. What happens at your church? And when you look at the reality, a lot of churches are member-driven. What that means is what's actually important, what gets done, decisions that get made, and direction you move in comes down to what the members want. It kind of functions like a club, functions like a country club, and everybody gets a vote. We bought into the democracy idea because America loves democracy, and it's probably the best governmental model available on the planet. But we also thought it would work really well in the church, which it really doesn't work super well in the church because we become member-driven that way. And so we sort of push down instead of asking. The Bible talks about apostles, prophets, pastors, teachers, and evangelists helping to lead the church under the guidance of elders. Instead, we have a bunch of elders sticking their finger in the wind, trying to see where the people want and trying to please the people. Instead of representing God to the people, we're trying to go back to the board and represent the people to the board. That's a different way of leading. That's a member-driven church. So like everyone sort of gets an equal vote. So the carnal Christian who walks in, who doesn't know squat about the Spirit of God, gets the same vote as the person over here who's been walking with God for 57 years. That's just a silly model. It's not in the Bible, but we love it in America because we're Americans. So this is an example of a canoe we've been riding for a long time that really doesn't work. It never worked very well in America. We just don't ask those questions because we think it's in the Bible somewhere. It's not. But a member-driven church will not thrive in the future, okay? It will not thrive. It by its very definition, becomes a club, okay? I'll tell you what else doesn't work is a maintenance-driven church. And many churches I see are maintenance-driven, okay? The purpose becomes keeping our doors open. Because we're struggling, finances are tight, we're trying to get by, and so everything becomes about preserving the entity of us keeping the doors open, sort of surviving, getting week to week. How are we going to have enough money to pay the light bill? We got to get a preacher in here. And to sort of, it becomes this sort of inward energy at just sort of surviving. And this is sort of out of the result of the fact that a lot of churches are struggling, and it's a very natural thing. And I don't mean to sound condemning on these things, but I am trying to shine a light on it and say, if we're committed to a maintenance-driven model, we're never going to thrive and penetrate society and transform the world for Christ. Because all we're really trying to do is keep our doors open. Keeping your doors open and reaching people are different missions. Also, I see some churches that are kind of me-driven. We live in a very consumer-driven society, and business has taught us, what does the customer want? Give it to them, right? And so we're used to that everywhere we go. And with the Amazonification of the world, we can go online and get exactly what we want. I'm shopping for stuff right now on Amazon, trying to get the right thing. I can put in all my parameters and get exactly what I want. And we bring all that to the church. And so we've got the culture of church hopping and shopping, and I'll go and find what I like. And what that means is then in the church sometimes we start wanting to keep people happy, and it becomes a sort of me-driven entity. So what it boils down to is who has power, who's in charge, and those people kind of get their preferences. They get their way. That's a me-driven church. Well, that's not a mission-driven church, okay? That's a me-driven church. So it might be the elders, it might be the people with money, it might be the people, the family that's been there forever, or can get you in trouble if you don't do what they want, or maybe they manipulate you because they're just that kind of way, or whatever. So, but a me-driven church is not a mission-driven church. So when we say mission-driven, what we're talking about is when we're trying to decide how we budget, the mission drives it, not me, because I'm the minister, or not me because I'm an elder, or not me because my family's been here forever. The mission drives the budget. So you have to ask, what's most effective for the mission? See? When you're a mission-driven church and you're going to hire a role, you don't just say, well, I guess we hire our youth minister next because that's what every church on the street did that. It's like, wait, what? What would the mission say we should do next? What is God saying as he's leading us on this? So you ask, everything comes back to mission. Every dime you spend, every program you start, every program you stop, every event you hold, every sermon you preach, everything you do gets to be driven by the one question of, why are we here and what are we trying to really do? So this is a sort of gut check to say, and I think every church probably has some components of me-driven, maintenance-driven, and member-driven sometimes that leak in. What we're trying to do is no one's going to achieve the perfect mission-driven church, but the more we can move in that direction, the more healthy we'll be and the more likely we'll connect with our culture, okay? So mission-driven, that's a big one. One quick reminder on mission-driven. We need to focus on conversion growth as much as we can. There are other kinds of growth in a church, right? Transfer growth, for example, is where someone comes to your church from another church. And who doesn't love that? What a joy that is when someone comes into your church. It's like, a freshly grown leader or someone that already understands the Bible, they're on board, and you want to just hug them and say thank you and welcome aboard, and how can we put you to work? It's great. But it isn't necessarily the mission. Jesus didn't say, go and find disciples. He said, go and make disciples. So we haven't really accomplished mission there. Now, it's going to take us just as much time. If we have a church that's growing, a lot of people say, my church is growing, and what they mean is they have more people who attend and sit in their seats on Sunday. But when you count them up, sometimes what you discover is they've just collected a bunch of sheep from other folds. They haven't really made any new disciples. So we haven't really gained, we're not changing the world that Jesus sent us to change. We haven't actually made disciples. So this gets to be like, this is pretty important. So that's why we got to focus on transfer growth. On conversion growth. Like, is there someone who knows Jesus today that wouldn't have a year ago because of the witness of your church? And if you've got one of those, you celebrate it and you make a hero out of everyone who was a part of that process, because that's the win. What we often do instead is we just sort of count butts and seats and then put that number on the wall and draw a circle around it and call that the target. after the fact. Like, that's what we were aiming for. Well, growing a church isn't the goal. Making disciples is the goal. Now, it turns out when you make disciples, you'll grow. You will. But we have to get the order straight. So focusing on conversion growth. That's why we spent time talking about the nuns, because that's who we're trying to convert to a place of saving faith in Jesus Christ. So I think this means we've got to celebrate biological growth. Biological growth, you know what that is? You have babies. So get young families in, because that's a pretty good sign of health. Young families have babies. That's a good sign of growth. But if that's all the growth you're having, we're not really transforming society either, are we? Biological growth makes us joyful. Transfer growth, it's happy, welcome it. Prodigal growth is good. Prodigal growth is when someone got de-churched. They sort of grew up in your church, and I mean, Vance strikes me as a prodigal growth. Absolutely. Vance took a long little spiritual vacation from God and came home, and the Father was waiting for him with open arms. There's nothing, the only thing better than that is conversion growth, because it's sort of, he was already in, then he was like -1 back to +1, net 0. See what I'm saying? Conversion growth is the name of the game. Name of the game, and we've got to figure out how to do that. Mission-driven is challenging because we used to just open the door and everybody came in, and now they're not coming to us. There are still some unchurched people in our culture who will seek out a church and come to you on a Sunday morning experience. But more and more, that's a shrinking piece of the pie. That's a shrinking piece of the pie. The greater piece of the pie are those who aren't looking for you at all, and we've got to go look for them, and that's going to lead to some of these other points we're going to make. So, sometimes I think churches just have to dwell. I told you I was going to dwell here, and some of you are like, I think I got it already, but I'm not going to leave yet, because I think this is where nothing else we talk about really matters if we don't get this right. Sometimes we're probably not as passionate or focused on actually making new disciples as we are caring for the ones we already have. And that both are important. They are. It turns out if you focus your church on reaching lost people, you will in the process grow up the ones you already have. And they in the process can experience fellowship and richness. But if you focus your church on caring for those you have and fellowship and teaching, you won't also automatically, as a byproduct, get outreach. You see what I'm saying? You focus on outreach, you get fellowship, and you get, the most mature thing we could ever do is reach lost people. Who cared more for lost people than anyone? Jesus. So when we get in our holy huddles and we bundle up in our little Bible studies, and we think that Bible knowledge equals spiritual maturity, well, we don't look very much like Jesus at all. Because Jesus is the measure of spiritual maturity. He is the measure. You want to know what spiritual maturity looks like? Look at Jesus and ask yourself, do I look like him? Did Jesus spend time in a holy huddle memorizing Scripture? No. He lived Scripture out on the streets with people who are far from God. He had a great heart for lost people. So if we can't name those people in our life that we know who are lost, that we're somehow praying for, interacting with, we're not as spiritual as we think. See, so we've kind of got this mentality that we gotta. It's an either or. We don't want to be a church that compromise. Well, it's like, you know what? We need to also worry about not compromising the other way. Like sometimes we compromise too much by giving up our outreach. So I'm trying to push on us a little bit and personally, intentionally here. Are we willing to pay the price where it might cost you something to get beyond the words of saying we love lost people to actually take up our cross and follow Jesus? So of course I want to reach lost people. Of course I want to be mission driven, but I don't want the music to change. And now it gets real. All of a sudden. It's like, you're not asking me to raise money, are you? Or park further away from the building. Or go to church at a different time, or move Sunday school classrooms, or I don't want, I want to reach lost people. I just don't want the older members to feel neglected, or you're not asking me to start a new church, are you? I don't want that pastor dressed in like Jeff Madison. Look at him. He's got a T-shirt on. You don't look like a pastor. I want to reach lost people, but I don't want him to look like that. See, I'm poking fun in a way, but this is exactly where we live and where the battle's won or lost, see? I want to reach lost people, but I don't want to watch someone on video. I got to do it the way we've always done it. I want to reach lost people, but I don't want to get to know my neighbors or try a new event or try something different. I don't want those dang millennials, those kids, they don't know squat about life. I don't want them leading. I don't want them doing stuff. They don't know anything. I don't want to attend church on Saturday night, whatever it would be. I'm not saying those are the things you got to do. I'm just saying we probably got to do something other than what we've been doing if we're going to reach people we haven't been reaching. Don't you think? So, mission first means making changes in your church. So you're not just okay if an unchurched person rolls in, but realizing that they're the very reason you exist. That's a big shift. It's a big shift. It's been the largest shift in my life, of my ministry. It's why I moved my family to Maryland 22 years ago. Didn't want to go. Didn't know where Maryland was on a map. Didn't care. Like some of you probably don't care. Little tiny state up in the Northeast, but there was lots and lots of lost people up there. And I had a promise of a church leadership that said, we want to build a church for people who don't go to church. I went there with 800 people, and there's 6,700 people there now. 85% this year. 85% of our growth is from people who didn't know Jesus before. We're not just swallowing up, angry covenant church people. Here's a quote. If a decision ever comes down to choosing between reaching out to help a lost person come home to Christ or making ourselves more comfortable, a mission-driven church will reach out every time. If a decision ever comes down to choosing between reaching out or making yourself more comfortable, we're going to make the decision to reach out every time. That's mission-driven. All right. Let me just give you one little illustration here. You remember the film Titanic, don't you? Remember that? I think it ends or begins, I can't remember, with Rose reminiscing. I think it's at the end. She's reminiscing about the tragic death of all those who were aboard that ship that would never sink, right? And she was among those who were flailing around in the icy waters that night when the Titanic went down. 700 people survived by scrambling into one of 20 lifeboats. And those were mostly wealthy, first-class, social elites, those with young children. Rose was not one of those. She's one of the ones in the water, freezing to death, right, as the ship begins to sink. And she finds this corpse, remember, floating, bobbing along with a whistle around its neck, and she paddles over, grabs the whistle, and blows it. I think we even have some actual picture. This is a photograph of, I don't know if it's actual Titanic. I think they are as they were coming in. She can see 20 paddle boats paddling away, and she can, as she reminisces, she sees this. 1,500 people in the water that night. 1,500 people, flailing and freezing, 20 boats floating nearby. And when she blew the whistle, all of them heard it, but only one turned around and went after her. Came back and got her. Only one went to the trouble, the risk of rescuing her and pulling her into the dry boat in safety. Only one. 1,500 people in the boat, in the water, thrashing and splashing. 6 people were rescued. Okay? It's not that the lifeboats didn't have room. They could have handled up to like 40 passengers. Some had only 12 in them. It's not like they didn't have room. It's just that, what do you think it was? Why didn't more people get saved? What do you think? The mission wasn't saved. Yeah, they were in, and they're like, we're good. It's a warm, dry, comfortable boat. And I can't guarantee if I go back and get them that, maybe they'll push me out. Or maybe I won't like it as much. Or it just wasn't what they thought they were there to do. They didn't know the boats they were in were lifeboats. They thought they were safety boats for them. They didn't care enough. Wrong focus. So somehow, being rescued and saved erased their willingness to risk upset of some kind. Let me ask you a question. Those half-empty boats paddling past dying people in the water, would you still call it a lifeboat? It's an interesting question. Is it really a lifeboat? It was for the 12 in the boat, And for the 6 more they picked up, but for the other 1,500 who watched as those warm, dry passengers went by, I doubt they would be considered that way. They looked like lifeboats. They could have been lifeboats, but they really didn't fulfill their mission. I tell that story, you know why? Because one of those lifeboats came and got Rose. You're here at this conference probably because there's a part of you that desperately wants your church to be like that lifeboat. I want to encourage you. We talk about mission driven. It's not this high and mighty. You know what? It starts with you and me in our own hearts. That's where it starts. We got to look in the mirror. Make your life a lifeboat. Make your living room a lifeboat. That's where it starts. Well, I'm not in charge. I'm not in power. Doesn't matter. Make your small group a lifeboat. Don't make it a little collection of the already convinced only. But we need that. We need to go. Yeah, you do. But you also have a mission outside of yourself, or you're not really a Jesus-looking small group. Make your church a lifeboat. You don't have to have fancy screens and fog machines and light shows and big-name preachers. You don't need a huge auditorium or a rock wall for the kids. You just got to care and be willing to turn about and go chase after people in your community. There are immigrants in your community. There are young people who need Jesus. There are single moms who are flailing. There are working dads. There are retirees and ex-cons and under-resourced families and very successful-looking people who are hollowed out and empty on the inside. There are retirees who have no idea why they're even getting out of bed in the morning. And so we got to start asking, what can we do? And get the message out there. And the way the branding problem of the church has changed is person by person by person by person, word of mouth, as they meet someone like you or me who just communicates this message in a real way. If you're hurting and alone, there's a lifeboat for you. You just love people. If you're spiritually confused, you're angry at God, you've spit on God, you've been all over, you're drowning in depression, whatever, this is a lifeboat that's safe for you. You can be here. You can connect here. We'll be your friend. We'll come towards you and help you move forward. Whatever your need, spiritual, emotional, physical, relational, God cares about you. He sent His Son. There's really good news for you. People need good news. They need good news. Churches that thrive in the future will be mission-driven churches. All right, so when were we supposed to quit? Like right now? I don't remember when the break was. Is it 9:30? Hey, also, it feels like it's getting warm in here. Is that just me getting amped up? Is it warm?
It's warm.
Do you think we could do something about that, Marsh? Or is Tom around? Can we get some air going in here? Or you guys, is that not mission-driven decision? It's not about my comfort. Yes, sir. If we're mission-driven, that won't matter to us.
Doesn't matter.
Correct.
It's about reaching.
It's about kingdom more than it is
Way.
my kingdom.
Now, they may say we're.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
That's not our purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Is to bring people to these stores. Our purpose.
Yeah.
Bring them.
Yep.
To.
Did everybody hear what he said? So I think it's such an important point about being more kingdom-minded than just church-minded. And the flip side, I believe, is also true. That I want to be part of a church where the best way I can imagine to help you get connected to Jesus would be, come with me to my church. You know, of course, that's what we want. But my main objective is to not get you to come and sit in my church, but to know Jesus and to be saved and to be with me in heaven. And wherever that needs to take shape. And, you know, that then we keep our hands open and loose like this. We're not trying to hold on to whatever we have tightly. You know, we're just holding everything loosely. So, like, this is also, you know, as a minister, it hurts. I mean, you guys all know what it's like when you invest in somebody, right? You love them, and they are in your church, and then they leave. Yep. That hurts. sometimes. But I think part of the reason it hurts is maybe we just were holding on a little too tightly in the first place. Maybe they were never ours. They weren't our people. We're just, so I think that also speaks to what you're saying.
And sometimes, when you share the message with someone who needs to hear the message, they become a torch for many others.
Yes. And often the people that we influence for Jesus are much more influential than we are.
Absolutely.
Jesus said something about that. You're going to do greater things than I did. Okay, let me give you a couple of, as we kind of wrap this idea, let me give you some practical stuff here. I would ask this. I would ask a question, first of all. These are questions that I have to ask myself as a leader in our church. And maybe these will be helpful to you as well. Are you more concerned about who you're trying to keep or who you're trying to reach? That can be a helpful kind of question. Are you more concerned about who you're trying to keep or who you are trying to reach? Because there's a big difference. Trying to keep people will drive you in a certain direction to sort of maintain a happiness quotient in your church. But if everyone in your church understands that the mission is to reach people, then they're going to be happy when you do that. And you can focus then on who you're trying to reach, and you will keep the right people. But a transition from a church that's mostly about who we're trying to keep to a church that is mostly about who we're trying to reach can be a rocky transition. It can be rocky because we're coming at a fundamental sort of difference about why we think we're even here.
Perfect example is Paul.
Perfect example is Paul. When and why? What do you mean?
When Paul was the persecutor.
Okay.
And was reached by Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
He reached many.
Yes. So Paul, of course, yeah. He went from persecutor to globetrotter. Here's a phrase I sometimes use with myself, because I'm a bit of, by nature, and we have these different personalities. Some of you are gifted with a personality, you're more like a cat. You just don't care what people think. And other people are more like a puppy dog. It's like, I sort of like everyone when everyone's happy. It's like, can I make you happy? If I can make you happy, I'd be happy to do that. I kind of want you to like me. I'm a little more like that, which is not always a gift. Sometimes it's a curse. I kind of like it if you like me. I kind of would rather have you like me. And other people just have the gift of, I don't care what you think. My son's that way. He's like, I don't care. I don't always have that. But that's why this question is pretty important for me as a leader or a church person. You have to decide who you're willing to disappoint, because you're going to disappoint someone. Jesus was willing to disappoint everyone except his Father. His Father had sent him on a mission, and he was not willing to leave that mission. He was not willing to disappoint the Father, but he disappointed everybody else. He disappointed the religious leaders. He disappointed his family. He disappointed his own disciples every single day because the mission drove him. See that, what I'm saying? You have to decide who you're willing to disappoint. He wasn't willing to disappoint the Father, which was essentially the mission. But it is inevitable you're going to disappoint someone. And I don't take any pleasure in it. And when I do, I try to care for people along the way. But if you choose to make some changes that would open your life or your family or your church more to a mission-driven, reaching lost people perspective, you're going to disappoint some people in your church. But that's better than disappointing God. Okay? What's the next slide? Here we go. Pay attention to our baptism ratio. I'm not going to take time on this, guys. We're going to keep moving here, but you can make sense of those as you want. Pay attention to your baptism ratio. Conversion growth is better than transfer growth. In other words, baptism ratio is basically how many new members have we had this year? If we've had 7 new members, how many of those were through baptism? If all 7 were transfers, we got to be honest with ourselves and say we're not getting it done yet. If we had, pick another number, I don't know, 20. He's had 25 new members in a given year, okay? And if 11 of those were through baptism, that's a pretty good sign. Now, you still want to go in and say, were those all biological? Were those just kids? Or is that, those are the things, those are just numbers. They're metrics. But this is what the early church did. They paid attention to the reality. They looked, in the book of Acts talks about how many were saved on the first day. And the numbers, we count people because people count. And it also is our friend. Its reality is our friend. So we want to know what in fact is going on and what's the health of our church. That's what we mean there. Conversions may count as much, conversations may count as much as conversions. This is a radical idea in a way, but I'm going to give it to you. This is a continuum of a progression of people who are at whatever distance they may be from God. So let's just start over here at a -3. Here's a -2, and there's a -1. Far away from God. This is the cross, meaning this is the moment of conversion where a person steps across the line of faith and says, I believe. They become a disciple, a follower, a believer, a born-again believer in Jesus' name. That's that moment. So over here is +1, and here's +2, and here's +3 if you kind of think of it in those terms. Over here, you might call this person over here, I'm going to put AA to represent antagonistic atheist. That's a -3. This is a person who's they really despise the Christian faith. They're antagonistic toward the church. They don't believe. Okay, so they're way over here. -2 you could call a sort of indifferent agnostic. Do you know the word agnostic? An agnostic is somebody who says, I'm not really sure what I think about God. I'm sort of indifferent. I don't care. They're not as antagonistic as an atheist, but they're just indifferent. And so they're somewhat closer to the line of faith, but they're still quite a ways. And up here might be what I'll put a curious, we'll call this person a seeker. They are seeking. They're sort of curious, but they're cautious. They're cautious, but they're curious, and they're seeking out, investigating maybe the things of God, and they're here. Okay? And as we get closer here, here's a person who steps across the line of faith. Through whatever reason, they, through exposure to Christian community somehow, somewhere, a sermon or something, somehow they accept faith. And then over here we have someone who's I'm going to put it how about just NC for new Christian? Brand new baby, clueless about a lot of stuff, but excited and on fire, and there they go, right? And then as you progress, you mature, you might become a sort of more like I'll put maturing believer, okay? They're maturing, and they're the person who's like, now I'm starting to think about tithing, I'm starting to think about, I'm reading my Bible, I'm studying, I'm growing, I'm serving in the church, okay? And over here is a reproducing disciple. That's what Jesus meant. Go make disciples who make disciples who make disciples. That's his plan to save the planet. And this is a person who finally gets that. All right, so if this is a continuum, and every human on the planet is somewhere in one of these categories or on this line, what we've described in the first session is that, most evangelistic approaches as we've had from the 50s, 60s, and 70s have focused right here. Okay? Because these are people you can get to come, they're curious, even if they're cautious, they're curious enough to come into a church service. They're going to hang out with Christians when you invite them. They're going to say yes to an invitation or whatever. Or they're sort of brand new in the faith, and we're going to sort of reach them and move. But what we're seeing is that, remember the polarity we saw, we're like all of these sort of nominal Christians are sort of dropping off, and this is where the center of the church needs to focus, and we've got the preponderance, all the growth in American society is here, right here. And, read the news. Indifferent agnostic, the CarMax experience guy, or antagonistic atheist. Here's the point we're making up here is that in the new world, conversations sometimes count as much as conversions. What do I mean? Well, I mean this. In almost every case, there are some examples where an antagonistic atheist has a sort of leapfrog experience and goes over here and becomes instantly a Christ follower. But almost never does that happen. You know what does happen? They progress down the line. They soften in some of their convictions, and they move to this status of sort of, I don't know, maybe here I know. Here I'm not sure. Maybe there's something to this God thing. Or I witness another Christian experience, or I see some Christians, and it makes me rethink things, and I move into a curiosity stage. And when I'm up here, now I'm low-lying fruit, and I might just I have an opportunity to come to faith. How does this movement happen? Conversations and experiences with people like us. It probably doesn't happen because we got them to come to Easter service. It might, but not. That's a shrinking piece of the pie. And so, if we can get a 3 to a 2, that's a kingdom win. And angels in heaven are going, oh boy, we got moving in the right direction. They're not rejoicing like they will here yet, but they're excited. This matters. And we've got to start making it matter in our churches. That's why I say conversion counts. That's the win. We celebrate these baptisms and new life in Christ. We've got to also celebrate people in our church that are mixing it up with people really far from God, even if we don't have a big baptism to celebrate at the end of the story. Still a little messy. They're still pretty far from God. But you know what? I think there's some movement here. This is reality in the new world. This was the New Testament era. And then eventually you see the celebrations happen when people get, baptized and join the church when they step across the line of faith. So as we think about our personal lives, are you having conversations with people far from God? Are you talking to any negative 2s to get them up to -1? Are you talking to any negative 1s? Are you helping nurture? And then there's a whole other thing about helping the church grow from 1 to 2 to 3, but that's another conversation, okay? Conversations matter. We're just trying to legitimize that because in the past what we dealt with was what we call threshold evangelism, meaning the only thing that mattered to us, we kind of told ourselves, is if we get them a step across the line of faith, if we get them saved. Well, then we count that as a win. And we weren't really acknowledging the fact that a whole lot of stuff had to happen in a pre-evangelism way before that could happen. So we're just trying to say evangelism is not a sort of one-time event where we get someone to step across the line of faith. It's a whole series of events where we're working in a person's life to move them closer to Christ. And that is usually happening through conversations and experiences with God's people. And it doesn't always happen on the weekend within the 4 walls of the church. It happens on mission. We got to reclaim our missionary identity. Okay? Comments, questions?
Yeah, so Ben, I'm listening to you talk, and I just want to scream out like, yeah, because I heard you speak on this at another event, similar. You drew a circle, and then you put a dot in the center, and you said the point is to get people to Jesus, and he's the dot. The circle is getting people to come to church, and so often we focus on getting people inside the circle, and that's all that matters. But how people way on the outside, any movement towards the center should be celebrated. Well, that message burned in my heart for a long time, and I was talking to my daughter. She was frustrated because she couldn't get her friends to come to church. She was having spiritual conversations with them, and she was making them interested in taking a second look at Jesus. And I was like, sweetie, you're doing so good. She's like, yeah, but I didn't go to church. And I'm like, okay, my church is telling her that's what matters. So I changed my message. That was on the way to church one morning. I threw out my sermon and said, church, we got to get our heads in a different spot. And I preached that. And I've had people continue to come back to me and say, that message still sticks in my head. And it was on a whim. But our churches are ready to hear this. Like your members are ready to hear this because it takes the weight off in a way. Because they think if I don't get my church, then I'm failing.
It takes the weight off, and it also gives us permission to be on mission wherever we are, right?
Absolutely.
And to say, I'm always on as a missionary if I'm a Christ follower. So
I'm sorry if I'm...
it's fine.
I have to say something because I've just experienced the difference that this thinking is happening in our church, and people are eating it up. They want to hear it.
So real quick on what Jeff's talking about is there's something that sociologists have talked about called centered set and bounded set. And I don't want to take a lot of time on this, but I'll just because he mentioned it. So a bounded set is where Jesus is here in the center, and the circle sort of describes the confines of the church. And these are people then that are in, because we have a boundary. It's a bounded set. So you're either in or out of Christianity, in and out of the church, and the church is pretty good at making these kind of lines and boundaries about what qualifies you as in or out. And then there are other people who are out here, right? And that kind of worked in a church culture, okay, where everyone accepted that the church was the big boy. Well, it doesn't necessarily work so well in a culture like ours. And in fact, when you look at the life of Jesus, he was kind of always trying, they were very big on bounded set in the Jewish community, and Jesus was always like frustrating them because he'd find some person that they thought was way out here, some prostitute or some tax collector who was way outside of the bounded set, but he would say some radical thing like, this person's closer to the kingdom of God than you are. And they're like, what? You don't know what you're talking about. But he did know what he was talking about because the key is direction is more important than proximity. So someone who was an insider, they were a priest. They were an insider. Proximity-wise, they were very close to the heart of God, by all appearances. But the direction of their life, the legalism that John referred to, proved that they were moving in the wrong, they were a million miles from God. This is why he told the Good Samaritan story to say, the Samaritan was a dog, a pagan, way outside the circle. But at the end, the punchline of that story was, go be like that guy. See, so proximity isn't the key, direction is the key. So what this does is it gives us permission to say there are people all around you who are lost, who have these spiritual longings in them that God put there, and we want to find those, connect with those, and help them see the thing you're looking for is Jesus, and help them connect, make a step toward Jesus. And that's why, even though their life, so I've got some friends, they're so messed up, and it's like, first I want to get you to stop saying the F word every sentence. Second, I want to get you to get your moral life a little cleaned up, but I can't even start there. We've just got to start with their movement, and they're far away from God, but they're moving in the right direction. And I want to reward that and acknowledge that. And then is my goal to get them in the church? Absolutely. But it can't be my first step or I'll lose the battle. You were going to say something.
I think part of it has with the ones that are outside, their lives are so a mess that they need help. Whereas if you get to the middle of the circle, it's like you're dealing with people who kind of are more indifferent, where it's like, well, why do I really need God? My life is good the way it is. Whereas people on the way outskirts, the ones that are more a mess, know their lives are a mess and know that they don't know how to get out of the pit they're in.
Sure. What did Jesus say? He said, I didn't come for the healthy, but the sick. That's how he worded that. I'll give you one more here. I think it's up here. Preach to the Acts 17 crowd rather than the Acts 2 crowd. Does anybody have any idea what that's talking about? What happens in Acts 2? Who can remember what happens in Acts 2?
All of them came together and they went to the apostles' teaching and they broke bread in each other's homes and all that.
What happened? But that's the beginning of the church. What happens just prior to that leads to that? Acts 2 is the day of Pentecost, which leads to the result of the church that Jeff described. So Jesus lives, he dies, and when he resurrects, he pumps out a church, and he says, just you wait, Holy Spirit's going to come. And on the day of Pentecost, they gather in the upper room, and sure enough, it does come. And it's a pretty cool moment, and everything happens there. And then Peter stands up and he preaches what is the first Christian sermon. And how does he do it? Acts 2, what does he do? Well, he's talking, first of all, who's he talking to? He's talking to Jews, okay? They know the story. They know the history. And so what does he do? He recounts it in a way that assumes they know it. He says, remember when Abraham came, and remember Moses? And he goes through and he recites all of the Jewish history and brings them right up to where it's like, and then, guess what? Jesus is part of that line. And he came, and then he died. You killed him, but he's alive again, and you better figure it out. And they're like, what should we do? And he said, get baptized and repent and all that. Okay? Acts 2, you're preaching to those who know the story, and you simply just rehearse that story, and Jesus is the punchline. Acts 17 is the Apostle Paul. Do you remember this? Acts 17, he is now over. Does anybody remember where he is in Acts 17? He's in Athens, Greece. The Greeks are good people. It's the center of civilization. They're brilliant, bright people, those Greeks. But, did I mention I'm Greek? He's there in Athens, and he's at a place called Mars Hill, or the Areopagus. And what it was sort of like the academic think tank of the day. It was where all the intellectuals and academics went to trade the latest ideas. And the Greeks in those days, they loved trading their philosophy and talking about, Plato this and Aristotle that. And there was a plurality of religions. And I've actually stood on the Areopagus on Mars Hill there. And right behind you is all the gods, the whole temple, and right over here is the birthplace of democracy. It's like right there, like you can see it all, and they would come there and debate. And he got an audience there. He got in on the docket to be able to share his ideas in the midst of that. It was one little tiny sort of spot that he had among all these other ideas. And so when he does, nobody there is Jewish. Nobody there knows hardly anything about Christianity. They barely even heard about this upstart new rebel religion that is running around about this prophet from Galilee or something. They don't know anything about it. The last thing they know is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He can't start with the story. So what does he do?
Starts with their God.
He starts with their story. Yeah. This is where he says, I see you're very religious. And he kind of starts with things that they care about. And he builds from there. He quotes some of their poetry. I even see, you have a thing called, the one where we live and move and have our being. He's quoting their poetry. He's kind of using their language. And then he sort of taps into the need that they have. He says, I noticed you even had a tomb there. I was walking around town. I noticed you had a temple to an unknown God, as a marker to an unknown God. Can I name that God for you? Can I give him a name? Let me tell you about a God that I'm going to give you his name. His name is Jesus, and let me tell you about that story. And so he goes back, but he can't just say, you remember Abraham. He says, let me tell you. And he tells some of the same story, but now he's set it up in a way that they can sort of lean in and listen. And the punchline is the same. Jesus Christ died for you, and you need to respond. And some of them responded. Some of them said, you're crazy. Some of them said, I'd like to hear more. Acts 17. What do we live in a world today? What kind of world we live in? Acts 2 or Acts 17? We start on Mars Hill. We start in a sort of, where are you at? This is why preaching has changed. And I'm a big fan of preaching through the Bible. I think it's a good way to do it. But you know what? People aren't getting out of bed in the morning, if you're not a believer, asking, gee, I wonder what Exodus 17 says. What they are wondering is, how in the world am I going to get through the day? Or what's my family issues going to resolve? They're starting with their own felt need. And I think wise preaching, as one example, connects with people. Now, you're still going to preach just as much Bible as you ever did. Don't let anyone tell you it's not biblical preaching if it's not got a certain name in front of it, expository or whatever. Look at the preaching in the Bible. Okay, preaching in the Bible wasn't expository. Okay, preach the Bible, but connect with people's needs. Connect with people's needs. All right. So that's one example. But those are all things that fit under this idea of mission-driven, not maintenance-driven, not me-driven, and not member-driven. All right. Well, we got through one of our 10. I was going to try to get through 2 in this session, but maybe what we'll do is I think we need a break. And are we going to start up again at 10? Is that the schedule, John? Do you remember? Does anyone have that schedule in front of them?
It's 9:30 to 10 is the break.
Let's take our break now, and then at 10, let's start at 10 sharp. Okay, so wander in here at 9:55. That'll give us about 20 minutes to break. And just